So, a couple of things. You have a whiteboard and a whiteboard marker and eraser. That is for you to take with you. You can use it however you want. If you get isolated or quarantined, you need to take that with you, because if there's an assignment or exam, that's what you're going to use to take it for you. Okay? If we happen to go remote for any reason, take it with you. That's what it's for. If you want to use it for other things until then, have at it. But that's for if we have to do assignments remotely. Cool? All right. We're having a discussion today on the two articles. Everybody's got two colored balls. When you make a good contribution to the discussion, you get to throw your ball back in the bowl. Okay? That's going to ensure that everybody gets a chance to talk and you know where you are sitting in terms of your contributions to the discussion. Sound good? Cool. All right. So we're going to start with Taylor's article, Tend to Befriend. And pull up, this is sort of her model of affiliative responses to stress. We're going to kind of build our own model too on the board. And so we're going to start with, get a little markers out. So we're going to start with, we have affiliations. What are affiliations? Having contact with other people. And what kinds of contact are they defining as like meaningful affiliations? I mean, it's not non-kin related. What else? Yeah. So it's more than just, hey, how are you doing? I sit next to you in class, right? It's some sort of bonding, right? Some sort of reciprocal relationship, right? It's a relationship, not just simply an identity anymore, right? And so affiliations can have two outcomes. What are those two outcomes? Yeah, so we can have negative. That makes us sad, right? Or we can have positive. That makes us happy, right? So let's define what is tending and what is befriending. If someone defines that, they can throw their ball in the hopper. Meet it.
Tending would be like taking care of fostering, befriending, and like fostering this relationship or community together.
Yeah. So tending is care. It's care for taking care of your offspring. Befriending is the affiliations that we're talking about. This bonding with non-kin relationships. All right. So, getting into her article, right? What is her sort of beginning premise? Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oxycontin has already been implicated in parent-child relationships, which she started with.
Yeah. So, this oxytocin hormone, right, is involved in this. So how is it involved?
When you're stressed, oxytocin is released and it creates the need for affiliation.
Yes. So it's going to, right, we're going to promote Robert and Kate Reed, I'll go all the way. We're going to promote affiliations, oxytocin involvement. You don't make it in, it's fine. We come up with it. What does she talk about in terms of animal models with oxytocin? Someone describe that in the hall. Yeah.
Are you talking about like when it comes to social dating and their behaviors?
Yeah, well, they talked about exogenous, meaning giving animals oxytocin, and what does that do? It's okay, go.
I can't remember if it was in this or the other, but I think I heard like about the wounds and they injected with oxytocin. And when animals are in stressful environments where they're given oxytocin, they actually still have the effects of healing.
Yes, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. We're going to go through that whole experiment, right? Other things? You think one. Robert.
There was an increase in maternal behavior.
An increase in maternal behavior, right? So the idea is if we give oxytocin to animals, right, that we're going to increase the tending and the befriending, right? That's somehow related, right? So this is on the second page, the relationship of oxytocin to affiliation. And what does she say here? Halfway down there. What are the specific things?
Increase in physical proximity, increase in term behavior, growing in partnership with quantum
Yes, right? So all of those different behaviors, some of them are related to tending, some are related to befriending. And so with animals, they talk about befriending and about the amount of time that animals spend together, right? All right. So those are the behaviors. What about physiological responses? Someone's talking about physiological responses that they saw. Get her involved. Yes, Ash?
So the blood pressure increased and gas sensitivity, and then there was a sympathetic reactivity.
Yes.
The oxytocin was secretion.
Yes. Did everybody hear that? We're going to talk real loud because we're all in mass and everybody needs to hear everything, right? So decreases sympathetic reactivity, blood pressure, pain sensitivity, and most importantly, corticosteroid levels. What are corticosteroid levels? Stress hormones, right? Decreasing stress, right? Now, here's the big thing, right? Does oxytocin always do that? No. Well, what's different? Or when does it do that? What type of presence of oxytocin? Short bursts, right? So oxytocin leads to positive things, right? I should put down here that this is. So when we're positive, equals decreased sympathetic nervous system, right? Decreased cortisol. When we're negative, what do we get? The opposite, exactly. All right, so it's your short bursts are what's going to lead to this, right? What other presence of oxytocin doesn't lead to that? Oops. Can the presence of oxytocin lead to increases in sympathetic and cortisol? What kind? Elevated, sustained, chronic levels. Can actually lead, right, to negative. Right? When we're in, I should back up a second and say, let's talk about the negative side. What does she say about people that are in negative relationships? Yeah. And what happens to those people? What do they see in those people? Right, so those are going to be the types, right, of unhappy relationships. And it doesn't just have to be unhappy relationships, it can also be what? Yeah, strained relationships or no relationships at all. Right? That's just as bad, they say. So we can have what they say gaps, relationship gaps. And then what is the effect of being here? What does that do? Yeah. Right? So when we're in the negative cycle, it's going to promote release of oxytocin to promote seeking more positive, right? Hopefully. What role does environment play in all this stuff?
What is the difference that you have access to those? You're even able to find or seek out those relationships. So in the case of you're in an unhappy relationship, you're promoting those person that you don't have weight, and then I guess acquire a population that just sort of like feedback loop.
Yeah, it can become like this vicious cycle, right? All right. So that environment, we're going to see how environment plays a huge role in lots of this, of the things we talk about here, right? So the important part here, we're trying to think about how would you apply this type of research, right? Is to get out of this relationship and seek this relationship, right? So it's not just going to happen on its own because oxytocin is being released. And in fact, we want the short burst of oxytocin, right? Not continued sustained elevated oxytocin.
They make a distinction, I say they, she makes a distinction and says bursts of oxytocin and then calls the elevated sustained oxytocin in plasma. Aren't you having to get oxytocin from plasma other times?
You are.
Okay.
But she's just saying,
short.
like seeing cyclic oxyplasma, like oxytocin, I don't think they said the word plasma there, right? But that's the only way they can measure it, right? We're not, if this is humans and we're drawing blood, we can't measure it in the brain, right? But we can see it in the blood supply. Yes?
Does that have anything to do with why social media is so addictive? Because you get those short bursts of oxytocin, like with Instagram, Twitter, and all that, with like short-term social interactions. Like, does that have anything to do with that, or is that a whole nother?
Yeah, no, it could. I mean, I don't know that anyone's looked at that, but certainly there is now, social media is relatively new. I mean, last 5 years or so, right? Maybe a little bit longer. But people now do form, I would say, affiliative relationships relationships via, not just face-to-face, but via interacting with social media. So. Yes?
So she's saying that humans need to maintain this adequate level of like supportive social relationships. So would that be like the same in all humans, or would personality play into that? Or would it be like temperature, or the levels would be the same in all humans?
Yeah, that's a great observation. So there are individual differences, right? And I'll talk about men in a second. When we get to men, we'll talk about a study, a genetic study with men that showed differences. So it's not just when we release oxytocin, what does it have to do to have effects? It's not just circulating our blood, right? How does that oxytocin work? What is oxytocin? It's a hormone. So how do hormones have their effects? Receptors, right? And so getting to what Lena's asking, you can have two people with the same burst of oxytocin, 100 molecules of oxytocin released in each person. Depending on how many receptors each of those people express is going to really determine the effect of the oxytocin. There are two things that can determine the effect: how much oxytocin is released and the site that it's binding to. And we definitely know that there are alleles of more receptors or less receptors, that people have genetic differences in those things, right? So there could be people, and then there's other more complex kind of things like personality, right? Where maybe some people don't value affiliations, and so this doesn't really play into their mood or their stress, right? Okay, good, all good observations, questions. All right, what are the benefits of tending? Why would tending, we've been talking about affiliations, but why would tending matter? I mean, what's tending got to do with this? Yes, somebody, okay. Flip coin. You go first.
It'll increase your chances of survival of your species and offspring.
Yeah, great. I want to add to it.
I was just going to say with survival, it helps keep the generation going.
So how can befriending and tending interact with one another?
They support each other, I guess, like if it's both, like, if it's like a group of mothers, they're like, working together to help protect other young, it doesn't have to be just your young.
Yeah, exactly. And what do we call that? What's the name for it? You may not have. It's part of altruism. Evelyn, tell your cooperative breeding, right? Cooperative breeding, where it's an adaptive form of survival, right? We're going to have more than just one parent to take care of the offspring. We're going to have a troop of parents, mothers, or fathers, right? It's one of the sort of qualms, right, that Gary and Flynn had, is like, well, what about the role of dads in all this? It's not just about the mothers, right? So, there's only certain animals do cooperative breeding. Most animals don't do cooperative breeding, right? And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just some of the animals that we know do cooperative breeding. Voles, we'll talk about voles. Well, a certain species of voles does cooperative breeding. All right, so let's get into this Siberian hamster experiment. It's a good opportunity to get rid of some balls, right? Explain to me what's going on. What do we got? And if you're out of balls or lost a ball, maybe let some more people talk. Please.
So the hamsters received a skin wound and were then
Yes.
And the stressor, the increased cortisol, and compared to wound healing, but only in socially isolated animals.
Okay, let's stop there. So we have two groups of animals, right? What are those groups? Delaney, what are the two groups?
Socially isolated and then not socially isolated.
Yes. Right? So we have socially housed, quarantined. Well, there's something about that, right? So, I mean, this is like real life stuff. All right. So, what is socially housed? What's the difference between those two? Yeah. Happy. Not so happy, but in isolation, right? Okay. Blank, go in your bosom. All right, so then both of these get, as Lena said, skin wounds. And what are they going to measure? What are they going to measure? Oh, skin wounds and what? Cortisol levels. And then what are they, think about what are they going to measure? What's their sort of output? Yes?
How fast the wounds heal?
Healing, right? So tell me what happens with each group. What about the socially housed versus the isolated? How do they heal?
In the socially housed, they heal faster than those that are isolated.
What would you infer about increased, why would they have increased healing or decreased healing? What does that involve? The immune system, right? So they're kind of saying they don't really measure the immune system, but they're kind of inferring, right? Increased immune or decreased immune. So what does this tell us so far, what we have on here? We see a difference. They got the same treatment. Yeah, Robert.
Well, since we know that like immune system suppression is part of like stress, you apply it, I guess, from social relationships, how to counterbalance the effects of stress.
Yeah, so they both got stress, right? And stress can compromise the immune system. But it looks like something about socially housing them is protective against the effects of stress on the immune system. So how can we further disentangle this? What was the other treatment that they did? Yes?
Oxytocin.
The oxytocin. Someone's talking about the oxytocin.
Well, before the oxytocin, they removed the adrenal glands to knock out cortisol.
Okay, so that's a different thing. So if we remove over here, if we're saying that the cortisol is what caused this, right? What happens if we add in ADX is how you abbreviate adrenalectomy, remove the adrenal glands, right? So what happens in that case?
There was no difference
Yeah.
in the healing.
So now we're saying, hey, this stuff is linked because if I get rid of this, it goes away, right? All right, then what do you Someone who still has a ball, tell me about the oxytocin.
When you treat the isolated injections with oxytocin, they will be stable. When you treat the associated problems with oxytocin, they have a way of
What did this group get? No. She knew very well. Someone tell me what that group got.
Oxytocin antagonists.
An antagonist. We're in a block. And what happens if this group blocks oxytocin? What happens to her? Someone who still has a ball left, tell me what all this tells us. And I'll post pictures of all this.
It's basically like two forms of controls showing that it is the oxytocin that also feeling if you're stressed circulation.
Yeah. So, and even more than that, right? They're saying the socially housed are getting oxytocin, which is then protective. Protective on the cortisol, which then leads to the increased healing. Because if we block oxytocin, we don't get the protection, we get the decreased healing. Right? And over here we're saying these guys, because they're sad, lack oxytocin, because if we just give it to them, right, we get the same effect as if they were socially housed. Right? And then this part tells us that cortisol is the thing that oxytocin is acting on to decrease healing or to be neuroprotective. Why don't they do the adrenalectomy on these cancers? Yeah.
Wouldn't that then just make it so they had sort of that whole elevated sustained level of oxytocin and the counterproductive if they're removing the cortisol, the oxytocin will counteract.
Yeah, so what are we going to see if we take cortisol out of this? Is this going to change? No, well, it's not going to show us anything. That's why they didn't do it, because take the cortisol out, right, then they won't change this, right? Okay. All right. Good on that? All right, what about gender effects? We got to move this along. Last thing on this paper, then we'll move to the next. Yes, Steve?
Oxytocin is less effective against
Why? Yes, that's correct. Somebody tell me why that's less effective.
estrogen.
Estrogen interacts with oxytocin to increase its effectiveness. All right. Any other comments or questions about Taylor's paper? Yes.
So with environment, I know that elements society. So would that have, within a group, would that change the levels of stress, oxytocin, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Ashlyn. So the her question is, like in elephants that have a matriarchal society, does the environment of being in a supportive environment affect oxytocin and stress levels? And it's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing, right? Is it because elephants naturally have more oxytocin receptors that they form that type of environment? Or does that environment promote it? It's probably a both thing. It's probably that they're, I mean, I don't think we're going to answer that question, but it's a good question to think about it. I mean, it's probably a both thing, that they kind of are set up to be, physiologically set up to be in that kind of environment, but then that environment also then benefits and contributes to it. Sure. All right. I'm going to talk for a second about something that's not in our stuff, and then we're going to get, hopefully we'll get through all this. So I'll get to this kind of quickly. But prairie voles, these are prairie voles, are monogamous, meaning they mate and then the the male vole stays in the nest, does cooperative breeding, and even and continues to mate with just that one female vole. Meadow and other voles, montane is another type of vole that you might see in the research with this, are promiscuous, meaning they will procreate with whoever is available. Now, I mean, don't get like too much like stock in this guy. If he has an opportunity to mate with another female, he will. He's not going to like be in the presence of a female that's receptive and turn her down, right? But they mate and stay with each other, right? As opposed to these that are very promiscuous. So, interesting model, and I don't have time for all these stories, but if we don't get through all this, then I'm going to cover some on Friday, because I think we have some time to get into the course. How do you discover this, right? So a researcher, I think in Indiana, was doing like an ecological study of voles and like how many there were in the population. They're setting traps up, catching voles, seeing how many numbers of what species are out in this field, right? And they kept catching the prairie voles in pairs, and they kept catching, and all the others, they would only catch singles. And so they're like, hey, why are they always together? And they would catch them and release them, and then they catch the same pair again together. And that's how they observed this. And then they started looking into it. Oh, are they really, monogamous or not? So it's kind of a cool story. It turns out oxytocin is what promotes female pair bonding, but vasopressin is what promotes the male hamsters to stay monogamous. And there's a difference in vasopressin receptors between the prairie voles. They have more and a different type. The meadow voles don't have them. So it's not that they don't have vasopressin. Vasopressin is very important for blood supply. We'll talk a lot about that. Friday we'll talk about cardiovascular system. But so we know that this difference is vasopressin receptors. Yes?
I was just asking in other animals that show monogamous relationships, it's also sort of a universal thing.
Yeah. So I'll talk about in humans in a second. Not a whole lot of animals are monogamous. It's hard to find a monogamous model. So they were examining, okay, how does this happen, right? And how does, like, this guy had never seen this girl. They meet each other. Why do they form a bond? How does a bond form? And then how does it stay sustained over long periods of time? And it turns out that the first time that they mate, there's this upregulation of oxytocin and vasopressin that changes the expression of receptors in their brain, so it becomes kind of a permanent link. Okay? And so they did a study where they were not letting them mate, but they were injecting oxytocin as if to say, okay, does just the increase in oxytocin or an increase in vasopressin change these receptors? And if they just give vasopressin or give oxytocin to a female or vasopressin to a male, and they haven't been with another hamster, it doesn't cause upregulation of the receptors. But if they spent an hour together, the two spent an hour together, not allowed to mate, but spend an hour together in the presence of each other and then inject it, it upregulates it. So there's this y'all know what epigenetics is? It's epigenetics.
It's the difference in the expression of genes that are missing, essentially.
Yes.
I was just going to say that DNA is wrapped around histones, and there's markers in the DNA. If it's wrapped more tightly around histones, it's going to be expressed less. If it's wrapped more loosely, it's going to be expressed more.
Yes, that's true. And the main point about epigenetics is that whether or not DNA is easily replicated can be influenced by the environment and experience. So for a long time we thought, okay, genetic code, DNA, it's like this map, and it all just works this way. And it's like a code, right? But that code is influenced by what's happening in your world. So it's not a strict, you have this gene, therefore this is going to happen. It matters about what's going on in the experience. All right. Those receptors get upregulated in the nucleus of accumbens, which is part of your reward circuitry. And so these researchers talk about this, that like these animals actually become addicted to each other, essentially, addicted to being in their presence. It becomes very rewarding to them, right? And we experience that, right? How many of you have had a pet die? Right? How's that feel? Not good, right? I lost a dog this summer. It was like you go through a period of grief. You're like, it's just an animal. No, I mean, you form an affiliative relationship with that pet, and it hurts. It's like you're going through withdrawal, right? You don't feel good. All right, humans, another species that can be monogamous. Can also be promiscuous, but more often than not, form monogamous relationships. They did a study looking at marital status in men, and based on this, looking at differences in this gene that's a vasopressin gene. And it turns out that if you had, as you went from having 0 copies to 1 copy to 2 copies of this gene, the more copies of the gene that you had, the worse your monogamous stability was. So they had more, you were either unmarried or have had marital crisis. And if we ask your partner, the female in the relationship, the woman in the relationship, they report less satisfaction in the relationship. So it does look like, and it's very complicated, right? There's a lot of things going on with humans that's not just like this, right? But it does look like expression of this gene. Now in this case it's weird, they don't understand it because it's like more copies of the gene lead to worse outcome. And they don't know how having more or less copies of this relates to genetic expression. Like we can't take a slice of your nucleus accumbens if you're here and look at the expression of vasopressin receptors like we can in the phones, right? So it's complicated, right? But it looks like it has relevance to people. There's no, like, you can't do DNA and me and see if your partner has. Okay. So, what's the deal with Gary and Flint? They got a gripe.
They broke up over, I don't know what it was for exactly, like they wanted to do it maybe different ways, but I just know they went their separate ways. I think they ended up doing the same thing kind of with the animal permits. Right?
Yeah, so they had some specific issues with Taylor, right?
She understood the importance of male parenting, evolutionary interpretations of tending and interpreting, and patterns of filiation and male relations,
Yes.
and female competition.
So they said, hey, nice model. It's a little simplistic. You're not taking into account all these other things that are going on, right? And so, so what's the issues with that? Well, most animal species have single parent tenders. And the opposite sex is then usually competing for resources. They're doing 2 different jobs in animals, right? And in species where the males, They talk about a species of bird, I think, that the male is the tender, but the females are doing what other male species would typically be doing, competing for resources, right? So this sort of gets at, they're saying gets at men being fight or flight, more adapted for fight or flight responses, and women more adapted for tend to befriend because of their roles historically, evolutionarily, right? All right, so what about humans then? What do they say about humans? Or what influences maternal and paternal investment in tending? So part of it is societal roles. Is going to play, is maybe going to override physiological differences. But they do talk about cases where men respond more in a tending manner. And what do they find in those men? Yes.
Is it higher prolactin levels and lower testosterone?
Yeah, so higher prolactin levels and lower testosterone levels. If we look at a sample size of men and how they respond, I think they used infant distress, like who responded greater to the infant distress. And then they looked at these hormone levels, and people with lower prolactin and higher testosterone tended to respond less. All right, let's jump to this because we're running out of time. This is philopatry. It's a weird word, right? Philopatry. I don't know how to pronounce it because it looks like it should be philopatry. It's philopatry. What is it and why is it important to consider? Who can define it? Yeah, I mean.
Members of one-sex getting the birth group, members of another sex married to the birth group.
Yes. So why is it important to consider? In most animal species, how is that set up? Yeah, the females stay and the men wander because they're promiscuous, right? I mean, not the male animals. And that then influences our ability to do research on this sort of stuff. I mean, basically, they're saying, hey, it's not just about oxytocin burst and elevation and all of that. There's a lot of other things influencing these roles in the presence of these behaviors, right? Lastly, right, they talk about in males, they talk about like male aggression versus like how do these species, how do the differences between males and females in terms of aggression? And it looks like increases in testosterone and maybe changes in oxytocin, less clear, right, are what underlie whether the strength of that fight or flight response, meaning that this is typically the fight part, which is aggression, right? Versus female relational aggression. What does that mean? What do they talk about in terms of female relational aggression?
We talk about backstabbing and gossiping in humans and how the goal of that is to have them be isolated from their social setting.
Yeah, so when we're talking in big generalities, right? So I don't want to say like this is how all men act and this is how all women act, but in general, right? If you think about this at the extremes, maybe, right? When men get angry with each other, there's typically this outcome, and when women get angry with each other, they don't typically get in a fight, right? They act in these relational aggression ways, right? And if we look at a monkey tribe, right, a baboon tribe, like Sapolsky studies, right, they see this too, right? The male monkeys fight with each other, and the female monkeys are more sneaky about how they show aggression with each other.
So does testosterone have a direct effect on oxytocin, like estrogen does, or is it like?
I don't think so, no. But yes, that's important to remember that the females do have that extra oomph of oxytocin action because the estrogen interacts with it. All right, last thing. How do they talk about in sort of positive, that's negative affiliations. How do they talk about positive affiliations for men and women? When men form affiliative relationships with each other, what is usually around? Yes?
And usually affiliate with like family because of the philanthropy.
Yes.
Like that. And then because the women have to leave and find females that are not, and they have to invest more into their relationships.
Yes. Right? And they also talked about, so females have this, what they call reciprocal altruism, right? Whereas males tend to be more goal-oriented, right? That they're forming affiliations to accomplish something for the group, as opposed to form a relationship to accomplish something for me, right? The cooperative part. If we look at animals. All right, questions on this one? And I'll let you guys go. And we got through everything. What did you think about reading the articles? Okay? This is a pretty easy introduction. We're going to have one more difficult one next week. All right? On the cardiovascular system. But part of the goals of this class that I mentioned at the start are learning how to, getting into reading primary research literature. Okay? That's one of the things. And learning how that's important, not just textbook information. All right, cardiovascular system on Friday. Make sure you read that chapter in Sapolsky's book. It's got a lot of interesting stuff. Thanks.